Welcome to the third in our Taranis series. In the first video we installed the firmware and did the basic setup. The second video we then installed the board and the associated bits and pieces onto a frame, did the final configuration, and then actually took the frame off and did the hover in the back garden. In this video we're going to talk about how to set up the Taranis Radio for the APM, PixHawk and PX4. The setup is identical because we're all using the same software, Mission Planner, and the way that the boards actually work is the same as well. So in this video we're going to go through and use our friend the OpenTx companion here, and we're actually going to go through my PixHawk setup that I'm using with the PixHawk board right now. So the couple of things we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to talk about main controls. We're going to talk about the order they need to be in. Obviously the only connection we can have to the PixHawk is via either PPM or S-Bus. The order of the channels is really important in that case, so we'll talk about that. Talk a little bit about exponential dual rates. We'll also talk about adding a couple of extra bits onto channels 7 and 8. They'll be useful later in the series for things like auto tune. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about how you get the 6 modes out of your Taranis. There are 2 ways to do it. One is to install a rotary switch. There's another video on the channel in the Taranis series already on how you install that 6-position switch. We're going to talk about some of the same detail in this video, but we'll use the OpenTx companion to set it up. But if you're interested in actually getting a 6-position switch, putting it into your Taranis, setting it up as S3, and then doing all that stuff, I'll link to this other video in the description. We'll also then look at how you do the 6 positions by using a mix of 2 switches on the radio. We'll do the same thing, and then finally we'll have a little chat about flight modes. Flight modes is very handy to have on the display. The actual flight mode that you are in just helps you keep track of where you are with the PixHawk. Then we'll talk about a no switch. I always have a switch that I can flick in emergency and it will initiate a return to launch. It's always good to have that to override everything else, so that irrespective of where you are, trying to remember which of the 3 switch positions and which of the, you can just forget all that, hit one switch and the craft comes back to you safe and sound. And we'll have a quick chat about failsafe at the end. So the first thing we're going to talk about is there's a document which covers some of this already. I've actually wrote a couple of articles now for the OpenTx University. There's a new area called multi-rotors. I've written a couple in here, and the second one is using flight controllers. This is just really for APM and PixHawk, and this is also covers some of the stuff that we're going to go through in this video. So that's available as a download and you can look at that. So let's start with our very first thing. Jump to OpenTx. We'll talk about the order of the channels. So let me open my PixHawk model. So if we look at input and mixes, so the inputs and outputs, and again, if you're new to Taranis and this isn't making sense, I'd heartily recommend going and watching the Taranis series. It takes you through from very basic first principles up to doing some quite complicated things over a number of videos. Again, I'll put the link to the Taranis video series in the description so you can find it. But in here we have our inputs, pretty standard stuff. We have a throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder. We have the 5th input being the one that's actually going to be for our modes, and then we have another input. I've just put it on input 7 just to keep everything neat, and that's going to provide an additional switch that we can use for things like auto tune later on. One thing I'd point out here, all on the Taranis, all of the directions and weights have to be 100%, with the exception of the elevator. Now, we discussed this in the second video in the series, where the elevator appears to be backwards when you're setting it up in Mission Planner, but that's the way it has to be for order it to fly. Now, this is the same with APM, and we've covered it in other videos too, but just be aware of that. Everything else is absolutely as you'd expect it, with the exception of elevator. Mixes and the channel order, this is really important. It has to be in this order. It has to be aileron first, then elevator, then throttle, then rudder, then mode, and then you can put whatever after that. So I've put my auxiliary 1, my additional switch for things like auto tune, onto channel 7. Because what will happen is the order of the channels will be like this as it comes out over the PPM connection up into the PixHawk. So the PixHawk will read the first channel it sees as aileron, the second as elevator, the third as throttle, etc. If you have it in the wrong order, when you connect to the PixHawk and you're trying to do the calibration of the radio, you'll find that the control will move the wrong input and vice versa. So do it that way round. Again, this way you don't have to worry about your weights. 100% will be fine on everything. There, because we've reversed the elevator control in the inputs, we can just keep it 100% here. We could have reversed it here instead. So that is the simplest thing. I'd also recommend, if you're going to be putting channels together for aileron and elevator, I would always put some expo on here. I haven't put any expo, that's why it was a little bit exciting. So I'm going to put a nice healthy expo on aileron and elevator. Probably a smidgen on rudder just to make my life a little easier, because a little bit of expo makes it look a lot smoother. Okay, so there we are. We've done our inputs and mixes. Those are the first two things. Next thing we'll need to do is then actually set up a mode switch. So at the moment we actually have the mode switch set to a 6-position rotary switch on the top of the radio, but we need to make it so that the rotary switch actually falls, the value on each of the clicks falls right in the middle of each of the modes that the PixHawk is looking at. So let's just stop here for a second, jump on to a couple of slides, and I'll explain the principle, and then we'll come back and we'll show you how it's implemented here in the model itself. So here's the slide showing what we're actually starting with. So here's our 6 position switches, positions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the bottom, and what those switch positions correspond to normally in terms of pulse width modulation value, or PWM value. If we assume that the lowest position is 1000, the highest position is 2000, then we're getting increments of about 200 every time we move that switch. And that's fine. The challenge is that if we actually add the different modes for the APM and PixHawk over the top, this is how they map on. So you can see that unfortunately they don't map on perfectly. So if we kind of just flick through, you can see that in position 1 it's great, it turns on mode 1. We click it to position 2, it's still in the mode 1 range, so it's still going to be mode 1. Position 3 is going to give us mode 3, so we skip mode 2 altogether. Mode 4 is going to be turned on by switch position 4. Good, that's good. 5th position on the switch though is going to take us into mode 6, as will the top position as well. So that's not going to work great. What we actually want is for each of those switch positions to give us a value that's pretty much bang in the middle of all of those mode pulse width modulation ranges in Mission Planner. To do that, we're going to have to edit each of the pieces slightly. So if we make a curve that goes -90, -40, -20, 10, 40, 80, and don't ask me how I figured this out, I actually ended up sat with a ruler, a pencil, and actually kind of used a scale to figure out all this. I tried Microsoft Excel and I couldn't get my head around it, but this is what we need to do. So now we know that those are the magical numbers that we need in order for the Taranis to output the right values to access each of the 6 individual flight modes available on the PixHawk. It gets quite easy. First thing we have to do is create a curve. It needs to be a 6-position curve. That way each of the positions on the curve will match a position of the 6-position switch on the radio. And the values need to be -90, -40, -20, 10, 40, 80. Exactly as we've described, and that will drop each of the values in exactly the right place for the PixHawk to be happy. Then all we need to do is go to inputs, and then to assign on the S3 input. S3 is typically the switch that you have the 6-position switch plugged into. You can replace S1 and S2 with a 6-position switch if you're a big PixHawk or APM fan. On the Taranis Plus, I've actually added the 6-position switch as an additional switch on S3. But this time we are actually adding a curve to it, and the curve we're adding is curve 1. So now, as I move the 6-position switch, rather than output those standard pulse width modulation values that change by 200 every time, it's actually going to output exactly the right values to give us each of the modes. So it's pretty straightforward once you have these magic numbers to actually get that to work. The second way to do it then is actually use a combination of switches in order to get those values on the channel 5. So let's look at that now. So this time round we'll use a couple of switches on the top of the radio. We'll actually use switch E and switch F, which are the top left hand shoulder buttons. Switch E is a 3-position switch and switch F is a 2-position switch. So using those together we can give us our 6 positions. First of all, we have to create some logical switches to actually combine them together. So the easiest way that I've found to do this, and as with the Taranis, as with all things, there's multiple ways to do it, this is just one way, is I've created 6 logical switches that are using the AND function to actually combine the 3 positions as SF in the back position and the 3 SF positions in the forward position with each of the 3 positions of the switch E. Back, middle, front, back, middle, front. So that gives us each of the 6 available combinations with SF and SE to give us 6 logical switches. Once we've done that, we can then actually assign those switches to override the value on channel 5, which is the mode channel, to output those special values that we've already seen for the 6-position switch. The way we do that is go into special functions, and we can assign each of the logical switches that we've just set up to do one job, to override channel 5, and channel 5 is that mode channel again. And these are the values: -90, -40, -20, 10, 40, 80. So as I flick through each of these, you'll see the value change. Last thing we need to do, of course, is make sure that the input is right. So there's channel 5, which is the mode channel, and at the moment all I've done is removed that curve that we had. We don't need curves for this. We're going to use those logical switches to actually set the values. And just, we can either select SC or SF. We're actually using those already. It doesn't really matter, but we no need of tying up another switch in the mix. So we'll set it for SE. If I simulate the radio now, then what we can see is there's logical switch 1 turned on. As I move switch E, logical switch 2, 3, that'll take us to 6, 5 and 4, and you can change the values depending on how you want these switches to work, but you can see I can now access the 6 different positions. If we actually look at the outputs, so if I go into the servo, there we are, and we go down to channel 5, let's put it into the first position. So there's the low end. So the low end we want about 1040, which is what it is. Mode 2 is about 1300, which is where we need it. Mode 3 is about 1400, that's perfect. Mode 6 is about 1900, that's great. Mode 5 is 1700, and mode 4 is about 1550. That's all working perfectly. So that's what we need to do if we're using 2 switches. First of all, we need to create the logical switches to actually combine the physical switches together in a way that works. I'd recommend using a 2-position switch and a 3-position switch. Those will give you your 6 positions naturally. Go into your special functions and assign each of them to the number that we've already decided, the -90 to +80. Make sure that you've ticked on. If you don't tick on, they're not active. Last thing to do is just make sure your input is on the 5th channel. Make sure it's one of the switches that you're using already. No point in using another one, and that'll work. So that's how to get your 6 positions using 2 switches that are already on the radio. So the next thing we'll talk about then are flight modes, and by using those logical switches that we've just set up, we can actually do lots of other cool stuff too. Now what I recommend is when you get to this point with your radio, connect the radio up, go through each of the 6 positions on the actual PixHawk itself and decide what you want each of those 6 positions to be. Circle, loiter, other bits and pieces. If you're not sure what each of the modes actually do, the next video in the series actually goes through each of the modes and explains how they work. So once you've selected your 6 modes, and you can change them at any time, you don't have to stick with the ones that you pick first time. You can go back through Mission Planner and change them when your heart desires. But what you can do is actually then have the display on the Taranis Radio reflect the mode that you've just selected. So here's our logical switches that we've just looked at. L1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and we know that those are all going to correspond to particular functions on the PixHawk itself. Now in flight modes, what you can do is use the very simplest part of flight modes and actually give it a name. Now flight mode 0 I would always call none or nothing, because that's the default flight mode if it's not getting any other signal. And then what I've done is I've selected each of the flight modes in turn and gave them a name that actually corresponds to the mode that I've set up on the PixHawk. So when my switches are in a position to activate L1, I've set that for flight mode 1 and I've called it stabilize. If I flick the logical switches on the radio so that L2 turns on, then I have altitude hold set up. And what you do is you just make sure that each of these names match the names that you're actually setting up in Mission Planner. So there's my 6. I've got mine set to stabilize, altitude hold, drift, circle, loiter and return to launch. So as my logical switches kick in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're also displaying on the Taranis itself the actual flight mode. So if I show you what that looks like, let me jump into simulate. Let's go into Taranis itself. There's stabilize mode. If I click it down to the next position, there's altitude hold, there's drift, that'll be return to launch, and then we'll have loiter and circle. So that's the way it works. It's really handy having it in the display so you know exactly what mode you're in. Obviously you need to remember, if you change the modes in the PixHawk, that you come back into here and you actually change the name of the mode. You can change it on the radio just as easily, but it's faster to type it in. The other thing you can do when you have these logical switches set up, you can actually assign sound files to play as well as you flick into each of the modes. So if we go back into special functions, some of you might have spotted that we're starting down at special function 9. There's a reason for that. What we've done is we've told the radio, as each of the logical switches is tripped, play a track. And the track is actually playing a sound file that relates to the mode that we're in. So stabilize mode, altitude hold mode, drift mode, circle mode, loiter mode, return to launch. So as we go through each of those, we're actually going to hear from the radio, it will announce verbally what we're actually doing. So not only will the mode appear on the screen, we'll actually hear it as well. Now the other thing that we could potentially do is set up a oh dear switch, but we'll come back to that in a second, because one of the things that some of you might have noticed is, well, hang on a minute, we don't have all this logical switch stuff when we're using a 6-position switch. So let's very quickly talk about that. What you can do is, when you're using the 6-position switch, is you can still have logical switches being turned on that correspond to the positions as we move that 6-position switch around. Now the way I've done it is like this. So what I do is I use a function that says when A is approximately, which is what that wiggly sign means, the value of X. And that means that I have a little bit of wiggle room if there's something slightly out on the radio. And what I've said is that logical switch 1 comes on when the channel 5 value is -90, -40, yes, it's those 6 numbers again. The reason for that is that as I move the 6-position switch around, what this is actually doing is turning on L1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, just like we had before, by looking at the values of the mode channel and relating that back to the functions. So that means then we can do exactly the same, and we can assign those functions to play individual tracks just like we did before, and we can also assign them to turn on L1 for flight mode 1, L2 for flight mode 2, etc., and make sure that the name of the flight mode corresponds to the flight mode we have set in Mission Planner. So that's a really cool way that we can use things like flight modes to display the flight mode that we're actually in right now on the screen. And we can actually also do things like play sound files so that we can actually see what's going on. The reason it says none here, by the way, is that unfortunately switch 3 isn't simulated in the OpenTx companion. So the last thing we'll talk about then is failsafe, and the last thing that I've done on my Taranis at the moment is set up an oh dear switch. Now, because I'm using the 6-position switch, my switch F is available to flick into return to launch mode, and again, return to launch mode for me is an 80% value on channel 5. So what I've done in special functions is I've actually set it so that when SF is in the down position, it overrides channel 5 with a value of 80, which is my return to launch value. And I've also, just seems to be a little bit of a hiccup in the way the radio works, I've had to then also in here in special functions set it so that it plays a track which is return to launch when I flick it. This is very useful so that rather than me have to panic and try and turn that 6-position rotary knob into the right position to bring the craft back to me if I'm getting stuck, all I do is I just flick switch F into that forward position, and then that initiates a return to launch. It announces it to me, and hopefully then that means it's flying back. Don't forget, of course, to always click the button to make sure it's actually on. Last thing to think about then is make sure your failsafe is set up. You want to make sure that your failsafe is set on the receiver so that in the terrible instance where you lose connection with the model, it actually gets the throttle value down to 0. So rebind your receiver, make sure that for the moment that the throttle is set to 0, and then at least the craft will kind of come down where it is without flying away and hitting anybody or anything. We'll do a separate video about fail-safes and how you set those up later on, because you can actually set fail-safes up within Mission Planner for PixHawk, so the PixHawk will do a specific thing when it hears that there's a problem with the radio. But we'll do that in a separate video because that takes a little bit of time to cover. But for now, make sure your failsafe is set up, make sure your failsafe fails safe to 0% throttle, and then that makes sure that the craft won't fly away from you. So in this video we've covered quite a bit longer than I thought, but what we've done is we've talked about the main controls, how you set those up, the order they need to be in for PPM. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about the 6-position switch, how you do that on the radio, and then also how you get those 6 positions for those flight modes with a combination of 2 physical switches on the shoulder of the radio. Then we've looked at how you can use those logical switches that you've got set up to do other cool stuff as well, like play sounds and also display the flight mode on the Taranis itself. And then finally we'd had a little bit of a chat about the oh no switch, and we also talked about failsafe and why that's a useful thing to have. In the next video we're going to talk about flight modes in far more detail, so if you're interested you can carry on with the playlist and go through in detail what each of the flight modes do. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching, please like, subscribe, and happy flying.